Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today, 9th February 2022, Ghana Statistical Service releases Consumer Price Index and rate of inflation for the month of January 2022. Consistent with our approach for the release, we're going to share with you the definition and measurement of both Consumer Price Index and rate of inflation, release the headline figures for January 2022 Consumer Price Index and rate of inflation. We do disaggregations at two levels. The first level is the 13 dominant divisions of rate of inflation for the month of January 2022. Further disaggregation is done at the subclass level for food division, and then we do geographical disaggregation based on our 16 administrative regions. We end the release with highlights of Consumer Price Index and rate of inflation for the month of January 2022. Consumer Price Index measures changes in the price of a fixed basket of goods and services that are purchased by households. The inherent assumption is that this is purchased on a monthly basis, so once price changes, the total price of the basket would also change. The rate of inflation is a relative change in CPI, that is Consumer Price Index, over two time periods, i.e. on a year-on-year basis and on a month-on-month basis. Consequent to that, the rate of inflation is released on a year-on-year basis and on a month-on-month basis, and further granulation is done at a regional level based on commodity, type, and source of inflation. CPI is not a measure of price levels. As was indicated, CPI is a measure of the relative changes in prices over two time periods, that is either on a year-on-year basis or on a month-on-month basis. CPI gives us a sense of the price changes, but does not necessarily tells us expenditure or cost of living, as it doesn't take into consideration other cost elements. Data is captured on a monthly basis, and we do market readings of prices and quantities on monthly basis. The weight of the expenditure on items is derived from the most recent Living Standard Survey, in this case the 2017-2018 Ghana Living Standard Survey. In 2018, we rebased the Consumer Price Index, so on the average, prices in 2018 were equated to 100. So since August 2019, we've been releasing rebased Consumer Price Index and rate of inflation. Prices are collected from approximately 39,500 products every month. This 39,500 products is a constituent of the different brands of the 307 items that we collect prices on a monthly basis. These 39,500 products are identified in 44 markets, in which 7,726 outlets have been identified. Products have been ordered in a hierarchy of 13 divisions, 44 groups, 98 classes, 156 subclasses, and 307 items. It's the different brands of the 307 items that gives the 39,500 products, of which prices and quantities are collected on a monthly basis. The divisions across the hierarchy are ordered in a mutually exclusive manner, so an item can only be part of one class, one subclass, and every subclass can only be part of one class, and in that sense, every class can only be part of a group. CPI rate of inflation for the month of January 2021. Consumer Price Index for the month of January 2022 stood at 139.7 relative to 122.7 that was recorded in January 2021. Consumer Price Index for the month of January 2022 stood at 139.7 relative to 122.7 that was recorded for the month of January 2021. Computing the rate of inflation from these respective consumer price indices gives us a year-on-year inflation of 13.9%. Indeed, this is the highest inflation that has been recorded since our rebased figures in August 2029. The 13.9 rate of inflation indicates that generally prices of goods and services relative to January 2021 have gone up by 13.9%. On a month-on-month basis between December 2021 and January 2022, prices of goods and services went up by 2.1%. On a quarter-on-quarter basis, again, we see that this is the highest quarter inflation of 11.9 that we've recorded since we rebased our CPI in August 2019. We do the disaggregation from a food and non-food perspective, and also from a locally produced items and an imported items perspective. From a food and non-food perspective, we record 13.7 for food inflation and 14.1 for non-food inflation, indicating a 0.4 percentage difference between food inflation and non-food inflation. Relative to last month's food inflation, which we recorded 12.8 for the month of December 2021 and the 13.7 that we've recorded for the month of January 2022, it corresponds to a 0.9 percentage difference on a year-on-year basis between December 2021 and January 2022. This compares with a 1.6 percentage difference from a non-food perspective. I.e., from a non-food perspective, we did record for December 2021 12.5, and for the month of January 2022, we are recording 14.1, indicating a 1.6 percentage difference from a non-food perspective and a 0.9 percentage difference from a food perspective. We further compare the food inflation and non-food inflation relative to the rolling average, that is for the period February 2021 to January 2022. From a food perspective, we see a differential of 3.3% between the average from February 2021 to January 2022, where the average stood at 13.4 and January 13.7. From a non-food perspective, we see a difference of 3.9 percentage difference comparing the rolling average from February 2021 to January 2022, that is the 10.2 as against the 14.1 that has been recorded for the month of January 2022. On a month-on-month basis, we see non-food inflation inching 0.2 percentage points above food inflation, specifically with non-food inflation for the month of January 2022 standing at 2.2% relative to 2.0 recorded for the month-on-month food inflation for January 2022. From a locally produced item and an imported item perspective, we see a differential of 4.0 percentage point, where locally produced items stood at 15.0 for the month of January 2022 and imported items 11.0 for the month of January 2022. This leads to a widening gap between locally produced items and imported items. From the 13 division point of view, housing, water, electricity, and gas records an inflation figure of 28.7. The 28.7 for housing, water, electricity, and gas suggests that its inflation rate is more than twice the national average of 13.9%. And this is the first time that we are seeing a division recording an inflation rate twice that of the national average. The second division that recorded inflation rate higher than the national average was transport, which stood at 17.4 for the month of January 2022. With the exception of these two divisions, that is housing, water, electricity, and gas, and transport, all the other 11 divisions recorded inflation rates lower than the national average of 13.9%, and education services continue to record the least inflation. On a month-on-month basis, again across the 13 divisions, water, housing, electricity, and gas is the only division on a month-on-month basis that records an inflation figure higher than the national average of 2.1%. So with the national average of 2.1% on a month-on-month basis, the corresponding inflation for housing, water, electricity, and gas stood at 7.3%, which suggests a more than 3 times difference between the national average and the division housing, water, electricity, and gas. All the other 12 divisions recorded inflation rates lower than the national average of 2.1%. With this, we did record deflation for alcoholic beverages, tobacco, and narcotics to the tune of 0.1%. From the perspective of contribution to overall year-on-year inflation, for the first time we're seeing a shrink in the contribution of food inflation by 1 percentage point, and also we see a shrink for the transport component, and we see a significant jump for housing, water, electricity, and gas to the tune of 4.6 percentage point as we move from 17.5 to 22.1. So the contribution of housing, water, electricity, and gas, which clearly is the dominant driver of the 13.9 inflation that we have recorded for the month of January 2022. We look at the disaggregation from a subclass perspective, focusing on the food inflation division on a year-on-year basis and also on a month-on-month basis. On a year-on-year basis, we see 6 subclasses recording inflation rates higher than the national average, specifically with oil and fats having the highest rate of inflation of 20.2%, closely followed by cereal products 18.1%. On a month-on-month basis, keeping the national average of 2.0 in mind, we identify 4 subclasses that do record inflation rates higher than the national average of 2.0, specifically water, oil and fats, vegetables, fruits, and nuts. We see water leading distantly by 11.1% relative to the national average of 2.0%, and this is distantly followed by oils and fats 2.9%, vegetables 2.9%. We did record deflation for fruits and vegetable juices to the tune of 0.4%. We do a trend analysis from both the food and non-food perspectives, year-on-year perspectives. We see that non-food inflation for the first time in 7 months. The last time that non-food inflation surpassed food inflation was in June 2021. So for the first time in 7 months, we see non-food inflation surpassing food inflation by 0.4%, indicating that in the last 6 months, we see the dominance of food inflation over non-food inflation. On a month-on-month basis, from a trend perspective, we continue to see the volatility from a food and non-food perspective, and we see a close marking parity between food and non-food inflation. We did record parity for the month of December 2021. For the month of January 2022, we see an inching up of non-food inflation by 0.2%. Again, the volatility is pronounced from a month-on-month perspective. From a locally produced item and an imported item perspective, locally produced items for the month of January 2022 stood at 15.0% relative to 11.0% recorded for imported items, indicating a 4% percentage difference between locally produced items and imported items. This is clearly a widening of the gap between locally produced items and imported items. Indeed, the 4.0% that we did record for the month of January 2022 only compares with the pre-COVID-19 levels. We are yet to see the COVID-19 levels where the gap between imported items and locally produced items range between 6 percentage points and 9 percentage points. From a regional perspective, we continue to see the 3 regions in the northern part of the country, keeping the old administrative regions in mind, having the highest food inflation, with Upper West region recording the highest food inflation of 24.7%. From a non-food perspective, we see Greater Accra having an inflation rate of 22.2%, and this is largely driven by housing, water, electricity, and gas. These food and non-food inflation from a regional perspective culminates with Greater Accra having the highest overall inflation of 18.4% relative to the national average of 13.9%. Focusing on Greater Accra region from a year-on-year perspective overall and also a year-on-year perspective food inflation, we see housing, water, electricity, and gas recording an inflation figure of 47.2%, and this compares with the national average of 28.7% for housing, water, electricity, and gas. So the driver for January 2022 inflation rate is mainly in Greater Accra and specifically being driven by housing, water, electricity, and gas. From a food perspective, we see oil and fats having the highest rate of inflation of 28.8%, but it's always important to put into context the weight of this particular division. It has 0.3% relative to ready-made foods that has a weight of 2.9%, the highest weight across the divisions, recording an inflation rate of 19.4%. We share with you highlights for January 2022 Consumer Price Index and rate of inflation. Year-on-year rate of inflation for January 2022 stood at 13.9%, and this literally means that between January 2021 and January 2022, prices of goods and services went up by 13.9%. On a month-on-month basis, between December 2021 and January 2022, prices of goods and services went up by 2.1%. For the first time in 7 months, we are seeing non-food inflation surpassing food inflation by 0.4 percentage points, specifically with food inflation standing at 14.1 and non-food inflation 13.7. On a month-on-month basis, we see also non-food inflation surpassing food inflation by 0.2 percentage points, specifically with non-food inflation standing at 2.2% and food inflation 2.0%. Housing and transport remain the two divisions that record inflation rates higher than the national average of 13.9%, specifically with housing, water, electricity, and gas recording an inflation figure of 28.7%, which is more than twice the national figure of 13.9%, and transport recording an inflation figure of 17.4%. The contribution of water, housing, water, electricity, and gas was dominant, as it rose by 4.6 percentage points between December 2021 and January 2022, specifically increasing from 17.5% for December 2021 to 22.1% for January 2022. Locally produced items continue to dominate imported items, and we are beginning to see a widening gap between locally produced items and imported items, specifically with locally produced items standing at 15.0% for the month of January 2022 and imported items 11.0% for the month of January 2022. Greater Accra region has regained its lead in overall inflation with an inflation figure of 18.4%, which again is higher than the national average of 13.9%. Upper West region continue to see higher food inflation, although we see a reduced food inflation from 31.1 that was recorded in December 2021 to 24.7 that was recorded for the month of January 2022. Thank you.